Flynn Mercer had repaired broken things his entire life. He was used to being invisible inside places like this, places where marble floors reflected chandeliers and everyone wore suits that cost more than his monthly rent. Then she walked through the lobby, and every thought he had collapsed into a single, airless moment. Not because of her title. It was the ring. Small, crude, hammered from copper wire by a 12-year-old boy's hands 23 years ago. She didn't look at him. She walked past like he was part of the wall. But if Serena Caldwell had truly forgotten him, she would not still be wearing that ring. Flynn had been at Caldwell Industries for 3 weeks before he learned who ran the place. The work order came through a contractor agency. Routine maintenance on the 14th floor HVAC system, then the electrical panels on 16, then whatever else the facilities manager kept adding to the list. Flynn didn't ask questions about the client. He showed up, fixed what was broken, and left. That arrangement had suited him for years. He heard the name Caldwell the way you hear background noise. It registered, but didn't land. There were Caldwell photos on the lobby walls, a Caldwell plaque above the reception desk, a Caldwell signature on every visitor badge policy he had, to initial on the way in. He'd been in enough corporate buildings to know that rich families put their names on everything they touched. He was there for the pipes and the wiring, not the family history. He was 35 years old. His wife, Dana, had been gone for 4 years. He had a son at home, a contractor's license, and a thermos of coffee he refilled twice a day. His life was small in the way that functional things are small. Not broken, not abundant, just precisely enough. It was a Tuesday morning when the elevator doors opened on 16, and everything he thought he understood about his own life quietly fell apart. She was already inside, dressed in charcoal gray, her dark hair pulled back, her posture carrying the particular kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from control. The 2 other people in the elevator had found somewhere else to look. Not out of rudeness, but the way people instinctively give space to someone whose gravity they can feel. Flynn pressed himself toward the back panel and kept his eyes down. Then he saw her hand. It was resting against her portfolio, one finger hooked over the leather edge. And there, on her little finger, was a ring so out of place, it stopped his lungs mid-breath. Not silver, not gold. Copper wire, twisted and hammered flat, darkened with age, shaped by hands that hadn't known what they were doing, but had meant every second of the work. Flynn had cut his thumb twice making that ring. He still had the scar on his left hand, thin and pale, running just below the knuckle. The doors opened on 18. She walked out without once looking back. The doors slid shut, and Flynn stood alone in a mirrored box and tried to remember how to breathe. Her name came back to him in pieces. Not Caldwell, not CEO. The name that came back first was the one a girl had spoken quietly in a dark hallway 23 years ago at Green Lake Children's Home, the night a burst water pipe flooded the east wing, and 2 kids ended up on the stairwell steps together while the staff scrambled. He had been 12. She had been 10. Serena, the smallest, quietest person he'd ever sat next to, who told him she'd never owned anything that was just hers. He had gone to the maintenance closet, found a spool of electrical wire, and bent it into a ring because it was the only thing he could think to do. He had told her he would marry her one day. She had laughed, not unkindly, and slid it onto her finger. 3 months later, she was gone. A family had come for her. A good family, the staff said. That was all anyone told him. Flynn got off on the next floor and sat on the edge of a utility cart in the service corridor. He ran through the logic twice, looking for the part where he was wrong. Maybe it was a different ring. But he had made that ring himself. He knew the exact angle of the twist, the way the ends had been tucked under, because he hadn't had the right tool to cut them clean. There was no other ring like it. It had been made by one person, for one person, in a maintenance closet of a children's home demolished 12 years ago. That was not the behavior of someone who had forgotten. You didn't forget things you kept for 23 years. You kept things because forgetting was the one option you refused to take. He gave himself 5 minutes at the east stairwell window to decide. The rational case was simple. He was a contract repairman. She was the CEO. And the gap between those two things was structural, load-bearing, the kind of distance that didn't close no matter how much history you stacked on one side. But the other part of him kept circling back to one thing. She wore it every day, not tucked away. In front of board members and assistants and everyone else who passed through this building, she wore a ring made of bent copper wire by a 12-year-old with a borrowed tool. That was not an accident. That was a choice, made every single morning. Flynn understood systems. Something still running wasn't the same as something that worked, but it also wasn't broken. It was waiting. And he had never walked away from something that was still waiting. He decided to stay. He went back to the maintenance closet on 14 to return a borrowed wrench, and on the workbench, he found a short spool of the same gauge copper wire, standard electrical wire, the kind that lived in every maintenance room in every building he'd ever worked in. He cut a length of it and bent it slowly, the way he had at 12, and the motion came back to his hands the same as it always had. He tucked the finished coil into his chest pocket. Not a plan, a starting position, a reminder of what this was actually about, worn close enough that he wouldn't forget it when the distance between floors started to feel too large. He went back down the hall. There was still a faulty junction box on 16 that needed his hands, and he had learned long ago that the best way to stay inside a place where you didn't belong was to be exactly, visibly useful while you figured out everything else. The next several days had a particular quality, the kind of quiet that happens not because nothing is moving, but because everything is moving very carefully. Flynn kept to the floors he was assigned, fixed what was on his list, and watched from the edges. He was good at making himself small inside a space, and he put that skill to use with a discipline he hadn't needed in years. Serena Caldwell moved through the building like weather. You knew she was somewhere in the system, even when you couldn't see her. Her assistant's voice carried through glass walls. Meeting rooms went quiet when she entered. The staff weren't afraid of her exactly. They were careful around her, the way you're careful around something precise and expensive, aware that a wrong move had consequences. Flynn watched all of it and understood that whatever girl had existed at Green Lake, she had been compressed into something much harder by the years since. What he couldn't figure out was whether she had seen him. On the 5th day, he got his answer. He was replacing a faulty socket panel outside the executive floor restrooms when she came around the corner. No assistant, no entourage, moving fast, already looking at the phone in her hand. She was 12 feet away when she looked up, and for exactly 1 second, the controlled surface of her face cracked open into something raw and unmanaged. Then it closed again, smooth and immediate, the way a door swings shut on a spring. She looked back at her phone, altered her path by 3 feet, and walked past, without a word. She had recognized him, and she had made a decision about what to do with that recognition in under a second, which meant the decision had already been made before she turned the corner. Flynn picked his screwdriver back up and kept working. The pattern held across the following week. She never looked at him directly. But twice he caught her in a peripheral moment, once through the glass of a conference room where her eyes tracked briefly to the hallway where he was working, and once in the lobby at the end of a day when she took the long route around the reception desk to avoid the path he was standing near. There was no reason to take the long route. Flynn had worked around enough faulty systems to recognize one. Something in her was still conducting. She just refused to let it complete the circuit. He extended his contract. The facilities manager, a tired man named Gerald, who appreciated reliability above everything else, was glad for it. It was Gerald, indirectly, who gave Flynn the context he was missing. One afternoon in the service corridor, Gerald mentioned, with the casual candor of a man who'd worked somewhere long enough to stop thinking of it as gossip, that Ms. Caldwell had been running the company since she was 28, that the board had been reluctant, that she had spent years proving herself against people who believed the Caldwell name should have passed to someone older, male, blood-related, in a way the board considered legitimate. Flynn asked carefully what he meant. Gerald shrugged and said the Caldwells had adopted her when she was 10, but the old guard never quite accepted that as the same thing as family. Flynn said nothing, but something in him shifted into a different register, one that understood not just that Serena had been changed by her life, but exactly how. He waited 4 more days before he went to her floor. He had a legitimate reason, a ventilation issue flagged in a maintenance report that Gerald had assigned that morning. He took the back hallway to the mechanical access panel 3 doors from her office and was working on it when her office door opened and she stepped into the hallway. She saw him immediately. This time, there was nowhere to redirect her path. "There's a flagged ventilation issue on this floor," Flynn said, before she could say anything or choose not to. "I'm not here for any other reason." Serena looked at him with an expression that was not quite cold and not quite anything warmer. "I know why you're here, Mr. Mercer." Her voice was measured and even, the voice of someone trained to speak in rooms where every word was listened to by people who wanted to use it against her. "I also know what you think you saw." "I don't think anything," Flynn said. "I know what I made. There isn't another one." She didn't deny it. That, more than anything, told him everything. After a moment, she crossed her arms, not defensively, but the way a person does when they are organizing themselves, and said, "We were children. You did something kind, and I kept it because I was 10 years old, and I didn't own anything." "That's the whole story." Flynn set down the clipboard. "If that were the whole story, you would have left it in a drawer somewhere. You wouldn't be wearing it to board meetings. What I wear is not your business." "No," Flynn agreed. "It's not." He picked the clipboard back up. "I'm just saying, I noticed the difference between something kept and something held on to. They don't look the same." Serena was quiet for a moment, that stretched in a direction neither of them named. Then she said, with a flatness that had something deliberate underneath it, "You want to know why I kept it? You think it means something about what I feel. But you're looking at a version of me that stopped existing a long time ago." Her jaw was set, but her eyes were doing something her jaw couldn't quite control. "The Caldwells gave me a future. They also gave me a role, and there was never much room between the two. You don't grow up in that house and come out the other side believing in promises made in a hallway at midnight by people who were still small enough to believe in them." She went back into her office before he could answer. The door shut without a slam, a controlled sound, chosen, the kind of quiet that takes practice. Flynn stood in the hallway and stared at the ventilation panel without seeing it. What she had said wasn't cruelty. It was a person describing the architecture they'd built around themselves, and the description was accurate enough that it had its own kind of pain inside it. She hadn't been protected by the Caldwells so much as shaped by them, heated and bent and cooled into something functional and fixed. She had survived, and survival had cost her the ability to want things softly. He understood that better than she probably knew. He had just never expected to find it here, in this building, wearing this particular ring. The complications arrived in 2 forms, and neither gave him any warning. The first was Jaden. Flynn's son had been dropped at the building by a neighbor on a Thursday afternoon, a miscommunication, and had waited in the lobby for 20 minutes before Flynn came down. It lasted barely half an hour before Flynn had him picked up again, but in that half hour, Victor Hale had been in the lobby. Victor Hale was the kind of man who wore his authority like a second suit. Board member, old money, the type who had decided Serena Caldwell was an inconvenience to the natural order and spent his energy making that case to anyone who would listen. He noted the boy, noted Flynn, and the way his eyes moved between them carried a calculation that Flynn recognized too late. The second complication was that the watching went both ways. The day after the hallway conversation, Flynn noticed things that hadn't been there before. A facilities supervisor appearing whenever he was on the executive floor. Questions from HR about his contract scope. A work order quietly reassigned without explanation. Someone had started paying attention to him in a way that was organized and institutional. The company gala came at the end of the month. Flynn hadn't been invited. He was a contractor, not staff. But Gerald had asked him in early that evening to check the ballroom's audio-visual panel before the event began. He was supposed to be finished and gone before the guests arrived. He was not finished when they arrived. He was still behind a service panel near the stage when Victor Hale found him. Hale didn't come alone. He had 2 board members with him, and the kind of smile that meant he had decided tonight was convenient. He spoke loudly, in the specific way of someone who wants the people around them to hear, without appearing to want that. He called Flynn by his first name and asked what exactly he thought he was doing at an executive function, commenting on the contractor's badge, the toolbox, how interesting it was that facilities had allowed someone like Flynn such extended access without anyone raising questions. The room was not full yet, but it was not empty. A cluster of senior staff and early arriving guests were close enough to hear every word. Flynn stood there with his toolbox and said nothing. Then it happened. Hale reached forward, not a grab, something more casual and therefore more invasive, and touched the chest pocket of Flynn's work jacket, from which the edge of something was visible. Flynn stepped back, but the motion had already dislodged it, and the copper coil fell, the wire he had bent and carried every day since recognizing her, and it hit the ballroom floor with a small, clear sound that was somehow louder than everything else in the room. Hale looked down at it, then at Flynn. Then slowly, his eyes moved across the room to where Serena Caldwell had just entered from the side corridor, already aware that something was wrong. She saw the coil of copper wire on the floor. She saw Flynn's face. She saw Hale's expression, the expression of a man who has just been given more than he was looking for. Her hand moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, to her little finger, to the ring, and then stilled. "Someone want to explain," Hale said pleasantly, "what a repairman's keepsake is doing at a Caldwell event." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is about to cost someone something. Serena Caldwell stood at the edge of the gathering with her hands at her sides. Flynn watched her face for the thing he'd seen in the hallway, that 1 second of unguarded truth. But this time, the surface held. She was in a room full of people whose opinions had the power to dismantle everything she had spent a decade building, and they were all watching her. "This event is for Caldwell staff and guests," she said, her voice exactly level. "I'll ask facilities to clarify the schedule with contractors going forward." She did not look at Flynn when she said it. She did not look at the wire on the floor. An assistant materialized beside Flynn, and with quiet efficiency indicated that his presence was no longer required. Flynn bent and picked up the coil from the floor, dropped it back in his pocket, and followed the assistant out through the service corridor. He did not look back. But just before the corridor door swung shut, he heard the gala resuming, music, voices, crystal, and understood that she had chosen exactly what she had told him she would choose. She had described the architecture plainly. He just hadn't been willing to believe she lived in it all the way down. In the parking structure, he sat in his truck with the copper coil in his palm and the engine off. Then he called the agency told them to close out the Caldwell contract by end of week, and drove home. The packing didn't take long. Flynn had never accumulated things the way some people did. Furniture that meant something, objects that held weight. He had tools, clothing, a box of things that had been Dana's that he still hadn't been able to leave behind. He worked through the apartment methodically, the same way he worked through any system that needed to be shut down cleanly. Close the valves in order. Don't leave anything running that shouldn't be running. He did not take the copper coil out of his pocket again. He was aware of it the way you're aware of a stone in your shoe, present, specific, too constant to ignore. Inside the Caldwell Industries boardroom on the 32nd floor, the meeting called for 9 in the morning was still going at 11:15. Margaret Voss, the board chairwoman, had the patience of someone who had learned long ago that patience was the most efficient form of pressure. She sat at the head of the table with a single sheet of paper in front of her and let the room do the work. Victor Hale was doing most of the talking. He was good at framing things as concern when they were strategy, using the language of institutional responsibility to say things that were personal and calculated. He laid out his case with the practiced ease of a man who had been building it for months, the contractor's extended access, the personal connection, the scene at the gala, a disruption, a liability question, a matter of judgment. He used the word judgment 4 times. Each time he looked at Serena. Serena sat 2 seats from the head of the table and listened without expression. She had been in rooms like this before, rooms where the decision had already been made, and the meeting was the theater that justified it. She had the sentences ready, clean, defensible sentences that would close down the room in 2 or 3 lines that couldn't be argued with. She had prepared them in the elevator on the way up. She sat there listening to Hale and felt them dissolving word by word, the way a document dissolves in water. The shape still there for a moment, then nothing. Margaret Voss, when Hale finished, looked at Serena and said, "We need to know that this company's leadership is making decisions that reflect the company's interests, not personal ones." The room was very quiet. Serena looked at the table in front of her, polished, dark, reflecting the overhead lights in a way that showed her own face back at her, composed and correct. She had been sitting at tables like this for 7 years, and before that, she had been training for them, being shaped for them, fitted the way you fit a key to a lock. The Caldwells had not been cruel people. They had been deliberate people, and it had taken her a long time to understand that deliberate and kind were not the same thing. They had given her the Caldwell name and a future, and a role, and what they had taken in exchange had been so gradual she hadn't noticed until she was already formed around its absence. She thought about what Flynn had said in the hallway. "I noticed the difference between something kept and something held onto. They don't look the same." She had dismissed it at the time. The words had not gone away. They had sat in her, quiet and specific, the way things sit when they are true. She had kept the ring across 4 residences, 2 college relocations, a graduate apartment, and the penthouse the Caldwells had transferred to her name when she took the CEO position. 7 years of board meetings and quarterly reviews, and every morning she had picked it up and put it on without once thinking consciously about why, because thinking consciously about why would have required her to look at the part of herself she had agreed not to need. A girl who owned nothing had been given one thing that was just hers. Not a Caldwell thing, not a role or a name or a future with conditions attached. A ring made badly by a 12-year-old boy who had meant every second of the making, given without asking for anything back. She had spent 23 years not thinking about what that meant. She was thinking about it now. "I need to step out," Serena said. Margaret Voss looked at her. "We're not finished." "I know." Serena pushed back her chair and stood. "I'll be back in 1 hour. If the board needs to make a decision before then, that decision is yours to make. She walked to the elevator, rode it down 32 floors, crossed the lobby. The same marble floor, the same chandelier, the same space where she had walked past a man standing absolutely still and looking at her like he was reading something written under her skin, and went through the front doors into the cold morning air. She got into a car and told the driver Flynn Mercer's address, which she had looked up 2 days ago and told herself she would not use. His truck was in the driveway, loaded, bags visible through the rear window, a toolbox strapped down in the bed. He was already past deciding. She got out of the car before the driver had fully stopped. Flynn was coming out of the front door with a box when he saw her on the path. He stopped, and the stillness that came over him was the same quality she had seen in the elevator on the very first day. Not passive, but held, like a structure under pressure that has decided not to move. "Your building's on the other side of town," he said. "I know where my building is." She stood on the path with her hands at her sides, still in the charcoal gray she'd worn to the board meeting, the uniform of the person she had been fitted to become. She was aware of how she looked standing here, on this driveway, in front of this house, and she did not care about it in the way she had been trained to care about appearances. That was the first time that had happened, in longer than she could account for. "I left the board meeting." Flynn set the box down on the top step. "To come here. To come here." She looked at the loaded truck, then back at him. "You're leaving." "I had another job." "You told the agency that," Serena said. "You didn't tell me." Something crossed his face. Not the controlled expression he'd worn since the gala, something under it. "I wasn't aware I was reporting to you." "You're not." She came 3 steps closer, to the bottom of the porch steps. From there, she had to look up at him, which was not a position she occupied often, and which she found, unexpectedly, that she didn't mind. "Flynn, I'm not here as your employer. I don't think I'm your employer anymore, actually. I think I may have just resigned." The flatness in his face broke open just slightly, enough for her to see she had surprised him, which was harder than it looked. "You think?" "I left before they could vote. I'll find out when I turn my phone back on." She had turned it off in the car, the first time she had done that in approximately 4 years. The silence of it had been louder than she expected. "I didn't want to miss you." Flynn came down 2 steps so they were almost level. He looked at her the way he had in the hallway outside her office, reading something, measuring it, being careful not to mistake what he was seeing for what he wanted to see. "What you said in the hallway," he said, "about the person you used to be not existing anymore. Did you mean that?" She thought about lying. Lying was one of the tools the architecture of her life had given her, and she was proficient with it. Then she thought about a girl on a stairwell step at midnight, who had been given one thing that was just hers and had carried it for 23 years without ever putting it down. "No," she said. "I meant I was afraid she didn't." There's a difference. Flynn was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than all the silences between them before. Not avoidant, not managed, just present. "I made you a terrible ring," he said. "It's the best ring I've ever owned." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "And I've been given several that cost considerably more." He looked at her hand. She looked at it too. The copper wire, dark with age, on her little finger, where it had always sat. Then she looked back up at him and said the thing she had driven across the city to say. "I kept it because I didn't want to forget that someone once made something just for me and wanted nothing back. Not a role, not a function, not a name." Her voice stayed level, but only just. "You were 12 years old, and you gave me the only thing you had, and you promised something you had absolutely no way to keep. And I have been so angry at how much I still believed in it." Flynn came down the last step and stood in front of her on the path. "I'm not leaving," he said. "If you're staying." "I'm staying." She said it simply, and the simplicity of it was the truest thing she had said in years. The weeks that followed were not simple. There was the board's decision, which removed her from the CEO position with a formality that tried to feel like order, legal details, transition arrangements, a conversation with Margaret Voss that was civil and exact and permanent. There was a period when Serena lived inside the strangeness of a life that had lost its primary structure and had not yet found the shape of the next one. Flynn stayed in the city and found work that kept him busy the way he liked to be busy. Specific, physical, with clear results. They did not rush the thing between them. It had already waited 23 years. It could afford to move at a human pace. There was an afternoon in late spring in the backyard of the small house. Flynn had decided not to leave after all. Serena was on the back steps. Jaden was at the far end of the yard, doing something with a length of garden hose that was either purposeful or entirely invented. It was hard to tell with him, and she had learned not to ask too many questions about his projects. Flynn was working near the fence, where a young apple tree stood. Thin, new, still learning how to grow in the spot where it had been planted. A neighbor had given it to him the spring after Dana died, he'd told her. Said it would take a few years to produce anything, but that it was worth the wait. It had not produced anything yet. It was still working on it. Jaden looked up from the hose and said, to no one in particular, that he thought the tree needed more water. Flynn told him that wanting more than you need too fast was how things drowned. Jaden considered this with the seriousness of someone filing it away. Then he went back to the hose. Serena watched the two of them and felt something she did not immediately have a name for. Something that was not happiness exactly, but was what happiness was built from. She turned the ring on her finger once, the copper warm from being worn all day, and understood that some things hold not because they are strong, but because they are true. And truth has a patience that outlasts everything built to replace it. Flynn looked up from the fence and found her already looking at him. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Between them, after everything, the language had gotten very quiet and very clear. The way it gets when two people stop spending energy on distance and start spending it on something else. Something that, like the tree against the fence, was still new, still growing, and worth every year of the wait.